Hello and welcome back. I'm Nicole, a cottage witch, and today I'm filming my book wrap-up, reading wrap-up for the end of August. So I did a video, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago about the classics I read, so I'm not going to talk about those again. The literary tarot ones. That was fun. I enjoy doing that. But I'm a geek, so what can you do? Anyway, getting right into it. The first book on my list that I read is Cord Magic by Brandy Williams, tapping into the power of string, yarn, twists, and knots. There's not a ton about knots, but there is a lot about string, yarn, and twists, and making cords, and a lot of it I already knew, different types of fiber, different types of natural dyes, numbers, colors, all that sort of thing. It's fun. I've tabbed a few things that I may try at some point. I haven't made any of these cords that were suggested, but I don't know, I'll try and insert a picture later. I've got a loom just over here, a little tabletop one, and I did start weaving, which was fun. That I enjoyed. All right, next I read a couple of books. It was, what was it called? Women in Translation Month in August, as it is every year. So I tried to read at least a couple books by women in translation. One of them was, so I had this book called The Man Who Went Up in Smoke by Maj Showal and Per Wahlu. I don't know, they're Swedish. I apologize for my pronunciation. So actually the first book in the series is Rosanna, which I listened to as an audiobook, because I didn't realize when I got this from, I think, a used book sale, that it was the second one in the series. Or maybe I did and forgot. But anyway, it's the second. I don't think you have to read them in order because they're standalone mysteries, but they have the same characters. So sometimes it's kind of fun to read those sorts of things in order. And this was only the second one. If it had been like the 6th out of 10 or something, I probably wouldn't have read the first 5 just to get to this one. But I read the first one, which was more fun. But this one was more interesting. It was more, I don't know, thought-provoking, I guess. When were these published? I want to say in the 70s. Translation copyright 69. Yeah, so in the 60s. So it's not a new series. It's really quite an old series as mystery series goes. So some of the things that seem sort of bog standard mystery, crime fiction from Sweden weren't standard at the time. But yeah, it was quite fun. And sometimes you need just a bit of fun. Not everything has to be serious. This one was a bit more serious. This is Across Many Mountains. This was also Women in Translation. I think the woman who wrote it lives maybe in LA now. She's an actress. But she was born to a Swiss father and Tibetan mother. So it's about her Tibetan mom and grandmother, and I think great-grandmother, and how they had to leave Tibet when China started doing the things that it did and made it unsafe for them to stay. And so they left, they went to India. Eventually, her mom married a Swiss national, and then they immigrated to Switzerland. So I think it was originally written in German, I want to say. Not so very long ago. 2011. Yeah. So yeah, it was really interesting. I haven't read a lot about Tibet. I mean, I've heard a bit about it, but I don't, I'm not really knowledgeable, so that was fun. I think that's as far as I got in the Women in Translation Month. It was not very successful in terms of like the number of books read, but those ones were fun. Then I read Where There Was Fire by John Manuel Arias? I'm just going to take a stab at name pronunciations, so we'll see. This is part of my Read Around the World adventure. There is a Read Around the World book club group thing that I found on Fable, and this is what they were reading for Costa Rica, and I hadn't read a book from Costa Rica yet, so I thought, yeah, I'll give it a go. And it was interesting. It was fine. It was not amazing, but it was all right. As in, like, I'm kind of glad I read it, but I'm not going to read it again. It's one of these multi-generational stories that switches back and forth between the past sort of inciting incident with a fire in a fruit sort of, I don't know, banana plantation sort of situation. Not terribly ethically run, as these things don't tend to be. And then the fallout from an incident there on the next generations of the family. So yeah, it was not, it's not going to be a reread, but I'm glad I read it. Then I read, these aren't actually in the order that I read, they're just on the order in my list, or I will forget something. I read Lone Women. So did I say? So Cord Magic was for a book, Lisa Pepez's book club. And that video, that live just happened this morning. So I'll link that down below if I remember. And then this one, Lone Women by Victor LaValle, is for another book club, the 3 Girls 1 Deck. I think they call it 3 Girls 1 Book for the books, though they've only done one so far. Yeah, so I read this one for that. That live stream hasn't happened yet. I think that's in, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks. Not entirely sure. It was really interesting. I wasn't sure if I was going to like it because they were saying, I think they were saying it comes with a lot of trigger warnings, and there is violence. There's a, you know, not a small amount of violence. It's like a crossover between a Western and a horror, which neither of these genres are usually my thing. Although I'm starting to read this much more horror these days, dipping my toes in just a smidge. So yeah, just a little bit to see if I like it. And this one I really liked. The violence didn't seem to bother me. It does seem, so I actually listened to this on audiobook. I got it from the library, and then the library book came in. I thought, okay, fine, I'll try the audiobook version. And reading either gory or scary things by audiobook versus by paper book are totally different experiences. It's a bit strange, but it didn't, with audiobooks, it didn't seem to bother me as much. And I enjoyed the ending. It was fun. I won't tell you what the ending is, but I liked it. Yeah, it's basically it's one woman disappears from somewhere in California, I think, and ends up in, I don't know, I want to say Montana, and gets rights to a plantation there, and then things go a bit sideways, and people die, of course. There's a bit of blood everywhere at one point. But it's very, like, the mystery part is more interesting to me than the blood all over the floor parts. Yeah, whoops, I just dropped it. Coordination is not ever my strong suit. Then I read, the other audiobook that came in from the library was A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. And this was a lot of fun. I hadn't read any T. Kingfisher before, so I'll definitely read some more now. Because it was a little bit horror, a little bit gothic, a little bit mystery. It was fun. It was not a difficult read, but I liked the tone of voice of the narrator was just different and easy to read, a little bit sarcastic sometimes. Yeah, it was just a good time. Then I read The Maid by Nita Prose. This was a mystery, a quirky character mystery. So it's not said in the book, but I would swear she's autistic, which I also am. Because she's just a little, she has her routines, the things that she likes, and things need to be in a certain way. And then she does misunderstand people's intentions quite a lot, which gets her into a bit of a predicament with the police when there is a dead body found in a hotel room. But it's really well written, and I really like the voice of this character, and I've put a hold for the second book on at the library. So yeah, that was, whoa, things are falling over. Good, this is good. Fine, it's all fine. Anyway, yeah, very kind of quirky, I guess. Yeah, struggles with social skills and misreads the intentions of others. Yes, and her grandmother had helped her to interpret the world, like the strange things that she didn't understand that people did. And her grandmother has recently passed away, so she's dealing with that emotional processing. But yeah, it's super fun. It's really easy to read. really enjoyed the writing style and the tone, the narrator's voice. It was really good. Okay, what next? Oh yeah, I listened to an audiobook called The Best Horror of the Year, Volume 8. It's a collection of short stories in all sorts of different horror subgenres. Some of them very not for me. I don't do gross. I can't, yeah. Yeah, that's not my area in particular. But like weird, eerie, I can do those. And so some of them were good. There was a Neil Gaiman story in there that I liked. There was Carmen, what's her name, Mikado, something Mikado wrote a story, and then Stephen Graham Jones wrote a story, and those were the only 3 authors I'd heard of before. But some of the ones I hadn't heard of I really liked as well, and might have to look up some of their other stuff. So yeah, it was, I mean, it's always interesting with short story collections because it's always a bit hit and miss. Like there are always going to be some I like and some that are a bit meh, or just not for me, but you can discover new to you authors that way, which is also kind of fun. And then I went on a Virginia Woolf reading kick. So I was having the first half of the month I was having a fun with mental health time. Fun being euphemistic in this case. And I love Virginia Woolf. I read almost all of her books, I think, in university. I seem to have missed a couple, so I'm remedying that now. So I reread To the Lighthouse, which is one of possibly my favorite Virginia Woolf. It is gorgeous. Her husband called it a psychological poem, which works. The writing is astonishingly beautiful. And it is stream of consciousness, so it might be a bit strange for some people to read if you're not used to that, because it's a family in a little cottage type house on a Hebridean island for like a day, and it just, you I don't want to say you bounce between characters' points of view because it's really smooth and seamless, but like one character will enter the room, you'll enter into their mind and hear their thought, they'll leave, or there'll be a conversation, there'll be some narration, then they'll leave, and then it'll pass off the narration to the thoughts of another character. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but it's really, really beautifully done. I love this book so much. I will definitely reread it, probably many times over, because it's just gorgeous. And if stream of consciousness, like if it's something you want to try but it's confusing, you might try a good audiobook. I know Juliet Stevenson narrates a lot of Virginia Woolf's stories, maybe all of them. There are a lot of different versions. I think there are probably like 20 different audiobook versions of Mrs. Dalloway. But yeah, if you find a really good audiobook narrator, they can really help with those transitions that might otherwise be confusing between different voices, and then the narrator description, and then other people's interior thoughts, and then conversations. So yeah, but I love it so much. And then I listened to the audiobook of The Years, which is a bit longer, also a bit stream of consciousness, but not quite as much inside people's heads. There's more, I think the dialogue to internal thoughts ratio, it favors dialogue and narrator description a bit more. But that spans several decades, like from the end of the 1800s into 1928 or something. Anyway, there is one, I think, moment of not so great anti-Semitism. Virginia Woolf has been criticized for that before. She married a Jewish man, secular Jewish man, who apparently she had a fantastic relationship with, and yet these anti-Semitic sort of tropes sometimes still creep into her work, or crept into her work. She's long since passed away, and they were pretty like standard, thoughts for the time, which of course doesn't make it right, but it is there. It's also there in Jacob's Room, which is a much shorter book that I didn't like as much. So there's a character, Jacob, and then the narration is mostly the interior thoughts of a lot of women who interact with him throughout, I can't remember what the period of time in that is. But that was probably my least favorite of the ones that I've read. And then that was this one. But this one is also very stream of consciousness. And time is a bit funny. So it might be a bit strange to read if you're not used to that sort of thing. And then I read Orlando, which I had read in university and liked but didn't love. And I reread it now, and wow, did I ever miss all the humor when I was in my undergrad. That went right over my head. I had no idea what I was missing. It's a beautiful book. It's fascinating. It's not quite so stream of consciousness, but it is experimental in that it does things like one character lives for 400 and some odd years, while still managing to only be like 36 years old by the end, something like that. And the character is Orlando, and he starts as a male character up until he's 30, and then switches to a female character. There's all sorts of international travel, like between different countries, although most of it's in England. And it's beautiful. It's very strange, but it's because she was trying all sorts of new things with this character. There are a lot of interesting conversations about gender and sexuality. There are a lot of funny conversations about writing, the quality of writing, how difficult it is to write, who gets to decide what is, high quality writing, all throughout like English literary history, because it starts with in the era of Elizabeth I, so round about Shakespeare's time, and then progresses on to the mid-20s as well, 1920s. It's so good. I'm gonna have to reread it again because I feel like there's so much going on in that book that it could stand multiple readings and you'd still get more out of it every time. And now I have started, I can't really talk about this much because I've only just started Night and Day, which is longer and more sort of standard narration. It's less stream of consciousness. So it's a bit easier to follow in that way, but the writing is still really beautiful so far. So yeah, enjoying that. This one I'll keep out because I'm still working my way through that one. And then I listened to, so I have the physical copy, but I listened to the audiobook of The Ode Less Traveled by Stephen Fry because he narrates it and he's a phenomenal narrator. I just realize I keep sitting crooked and it looks funny. It's weirding me out a little bit. But he's an incredible narrator and a lot of fun to listen to. And he reads his own books. And so, yeah, this is basically the poetry class that I wish English, like high school teachers would take, because it is so much fun. It's so much fun. And everything about his English classes and learning to appreciate poetry that's boring, this book is not that. I think if you read it, you will come out with a better appreciation of poetry because you know more about it, but you have learned it in a much more fun way. It's not stodgy at all. It's a delight, honestly. And he teaches you how to write your own poetry. So there's meter. The first section is on meter. There's a bunch of chapters on different types of meter in English. Then there's a section on rhyme, then on form and the different forms. So you have like ballads, odes, other closed forms. Some of them are really kind of obscure. Some of them you get into the funnier ones like the limerick, and then you get into ones from other countries like the haiku, and you end with the sonnet and then shaped verse, like really wonky E. Cummings type things. And then there's a section on diction and poetics today. And it's just so much fun. It's what poetry's supposed to be. And somehow, so many English teachers end up making it really boring and lifeless, and this is just delightful. So I've read it. This is the second time I've read it. I will for sure read it again, probably pretty soon. My stack is piling up here. I don't want it to fall over. So then I read some poetry. So one of the books I listened to, was the poems of Enheduanna. She was a Sumerian priestess, both. And her poetry is basically the first literature that was ever written down that we still have. Like, things may have been written before that that are now lost, but people have actually, like, stone tablets in cuneiform, in Sumerian and Akkadian, and a little bit, I think, in Babylonian of her poetry, which is so cool. Like, the content of the poetry is not so interesting to me. They're praise poems to the goddess Inanna, and they're very repetitive. So that I didn't find so thrilling. Yeah, oh, a leaf just, I sometimes use books as like flower presses, and a leaf just fell out of Emily Dickinson here. But I feel like she'd be okay with that. Anyway, speaking of, she's the next poet I read, but her poems, I'll try and open it to a page that's not a leaf press page, have so many, this is such a superficial irritation on my part, but it's covered in M dashes for days. She loved those for some reason, and they drive me nuts just visually looking at them all down the page. I just find it annoying, which I realize is a silly thing, but it annoys me all the same. So I listened to an audiobook of a lot of her poetry, which was much better. I enjoyed that experience. Like, I still liked the poems as much as I had when I read some of them, but the experience was much more enjoyable for me. I also listened to an audiobook of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, which I did not enjoy. I know he's like an iconic American, I don't tend to like free verse is the problem. And I realize he is acknowledged to have done it better than almost anybody else. I still don't like it. It's just not for me. I don't know. I did then read, though, the love poems of Lord Byron, which is very much not free verse. It's very metered and always rhyming, and I think always rhyming, but always metered. And it's a lot of fun. He's a bit like, in the modern day, you can roll your eyes at some of the things he wrote and go, oh, for goodness sake, this is a little, a touch ridiculous, because it is a touch ridiculous, but there's still a lot of fun. And he was, like, I don't think you could argue that he wasn't good at both meter and rhyme. So I just enjoy the experience of reading that sort of poetry more than free verse. You can get into a rhythm, I find, more easily. That being said, there is one book of free verse that I read that I did really love. It's on the subject of blackberries by Stephanie M. Witovich. I found this because she won last year in 2023 the Bram Stoker Prize for poetry in the poetry category, because it's all about, let me find on the back here, her experience with female rage, which I can relate to, postpartum depression, compulsion, and intrusive thoughts. She had just been diagnosed with both PPD and OCD, which sounds like a nightmare. They pull from periods of sleep deprivation, soul exhaustion, and nightmarish delusions. And it's incredible. It's a little bit witchy as well, which I enjoy. That I just find it a lot of fun. Her poems are imagined horrors, fictional fears, and all the unspoken murmurs of a mind lost between reality and dream. It is free verse, which isn't usually my style, but the content of her poems is really kind of cool, and I haven't read a lot like this, so I might have to, I'm not even sure where to find other poetry like this, except for things like the Bram Stoker Award, so I might have to go back through their past poetry winners and find other things to try, just in terms of the content. Poetry that I have read and that you tend to have to read in school and stuff doesn't tend to be about these types of things. There are a few that are a bit gross. There are some that are just weird. There are a few that are horrifying. But when you're like, your body and mind are taken over by another being and other worries and horrifying thoughts and things, then apparently you end up with this. And so yeah, that was really fascinating to read. Then I listened to an audiobook called Committed. I can't remember what I feel like there was a subtitle. Let me see if it'll open it. By Suzanne. Unmeaning and Madwoman by Suzanne Scanlon. Oops. Now I can't get back to my other page because there we go. This I'd heard about for the first time, I think, on Bailey's channel. Bailey Jean Hall, link below. She's done a few, I think, vlog type videos about this book and about reading some of the other books that are mentioned in this book, not all of which she loved. But it was really interesting to watch her videos about it, and then I thought, well, maybe I should give this book a go. So I did. And sometimes, like, it's funny reading books that are a bit memoir-ish, because there are some aspects of the narrator as this person that make me think that I wouldn't necessarily like her as a person, but I can recognize that the book was really good. It was a really interesting book. And yeah, she reads a lot too, which I enjoy. So a lot of the book was her drawing on both her personal experiences of being in a mental institution in the 90s, something like that. And then also her experience of reading books by and about mad women. Like, I think Virginia Woolf comes up, Sylvia Plath comes up, a few others. The Yellow Wallpaper makes an appearance, of course. So yeah, that was pretty cool. Then I read a couple books by Indigenous authors, audiobooks in this case. One was Becoming Kin by Patty Krawak, and it's basically looking at, it was beautifully written. It's very short and looks at the relationships between white people in North America and Indigenous people, and how those relationships have been harmful up until now, and how they could be changed to be not only not harmful, but actively beneficial to all people, including Indigenous people specifically, and also to the environment, which is in a bad way at the moment. So that was beautiful. I enjoyed that book a lot. And then I read Winnipeg by Nigan Sinclair. He is a Canadian professor of something, and politics or history or something, and I think a politician now, or has been, something like that. Anyway, he's a figure in Canada, and Winnipeg is a sort of compilation of really sort of informal essays, I guess. They're not difficult to read essays. They're very, like, each chapter is just about different sort of topics about relationships between Indigenous people and white institutions in Canada. Like, there's a chapter on over-incarceration of Indigenous people. There's a chapter on Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a chapter on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There are some chapters about the relationships between, like, the city of Winnipeg and the government of Manitoba with what are supposed to be autonomous First Nations that are usually treated in a very paternalistic way by government. So it covers quite a wide range of topics to do with the really generally unpleasant experiences of Indigenous people in Canada. And so yeah, it's really good. I recommend it. I'm going to go to one of he's coming to a literary festival in town, and so I'm going to go see that. That'll be fun. Stephen Graham Jones is also coming to one of those. I'm going to go see his event as well. And there's one other author who is a ethnobotanist, I think. I can't remember. I have to order her book and read that, and then I'll go see her event. Anyway, the last book on my list of books that I read is Blood by Dr. Jen Gunter. She wrote a book called The Vagina Bible, which is fantastic, and the Menopause Manifesto, which I haven't read yet, but I will do eventually. And this is basically about menstruation, how the uterus and ovaries function. I just mushed those two words together. So there are chapters. It's so informative and helpful. It's like all the things that you should be taught in a sex ed class and just aren't. So there's a primer on menstruation, what is it, how it works, brain, ovary connections, basics of bleeding, hormones. Then there's a chapter on just sort of different concerns like the pelvic exam, which freaks a lot of people out. So she goes through what your options are, basically pre-menstruation symptoms like PMS, PMDD, breast pain, beyond the uterus, menstrual tracking, safety of different menstrual products, debunking some myths. The next part is on bleeding and pain. So there's a section on abnormal bleeding, heavy bleeding, when things stop or are irregular, polycystic ovarian syndrome, painful periods, endometriosis. And then the last part is contraception and abortion, which is exactly what it sounds like. And she just goes through like all the questions that you might have, that trying to find reliable information is ridiculous because the internet is a disaster in this regard, and doctors frankly aren't very helpful 9 times out of 10 about this sort of thing. So it's so useful. She is an OBGYN. She is Canadian, but I think she works in California these days. And it's just, her writing is really clear. It's really detailed. So there are some parts that get more scientific than others, but she goes through the research that exists on certain subjects and when the research is still like not very reliable yet on certain things. And it's fascinating. I'm so glad I read it. It would have been probably good to read it earlier or to have a book like this 20 years ago. But I'm glad it exists now for sure. So those are the books that I read this month. That's all I've got for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.